Okay, let's unpack this. We have sources covering one of history's most, just profound and enduring transformations, the incredible journey of Rome.
It really is
We're
incredible.
talking about a civilization that leaped from a tiny defense-focused settlement on a riverbank to the dominant power that ultimately defined the Republic, conquered the Mediterranean, and provided the blueprint for statecraft for the next 2,000 years.
And for you, I think the crucial element we're extracting from these sources is not just the story of conquest, which is amazing in itself, but the internal mechanisms that made it all possible.
Right. The how.
Exactly, the how. How did organization, this relentless adaptability and just a rigid discipline, turn a small collection of villages into a global political machine? We are synthesizing the core, evolving DNA of early Rome, tracing the institutional choices that paved the way for glory and, ultimately, for civil war.
Absolutely. Our mission today is a deep dive into those foundational lessons. We're asking, how do you scale survival into imperial dominance? How did they manage to create a political system so robust that it endured for centuries, yet so fragile that it collapsed under the weight of its own success?
A great question.
And the central reminder woven through all our source material is this. No great civilization is built in a day, and it certainly doesn't collapse overnight. We are tracing a journey spanning hundreds of years.
It is a phenomenal study in political evolution. We begin with the earliest defensive struggles against neighboring tribes, and we're going to conclude at the exact moment that the complexity and wealth of the resulting empire just shattered the carefully constructed system of checks and balances that defined the Republic.
When we conjure an image of Rome, we immediately picture, massive marble arches, paved roads, the grandeur of the Forum. But let's start where the sources start. Part one, the Kingdom period, focusing on the foundations of this city. And the geographic reality was incredibly humble.
It was so humble. Rome was never inherently destined for grandeur based on its location or its resources alone. It was essentially a small, muddy, defense-minded village.
Muddy. I like that word for it. It feels right.
It really does. It sat on the Tiber River, which was
Right.
certainly an advantage. It offered trade access inland and a route to the sea. But the immediate environment was challenging.
And the sources really emphasize the defensive reality of it all. We all talk about the famous Seven Hills. Were they really that crucial in the beginning?
Oh, absolutely. The hills, like the Palatine and Capitoline, they were natural fortifications. They allowed the early settlements to defend against raiders and manage the flood-prone plains down below, but they also bordered swamps.
Not exactly prime real estate.
Not at all. The initial focus was purely survival, establishing a stable crossing point on the Tiber. It was an excellent logistical location for controlling central Italy, but that potential meant nothing until it was harnessed by human organization.
That's the shocking contrast I keep coming back to. We're looking at a culture that built massive roads, aqueducts, complex laws, and the engineering marvel that was the Cloaca Maxima, the great sewer system.
A game changer for urban living.
A total game changer. And it all started from a place defined by adobe, wood, and just basic survival needs. The distance between the beginning and the end is astronomical.
And that contrast, it really highlights the core lesson from this geographic analysis. Advantageous geography is only potential. It's the organization and the discipline that turns a cluster of defensive hills into the stable heart of an empire. That necessity for structure, for basic sanitation, for roads, it had to be born out of a shared identity.
That leads directly to the question of identity then. How do you unify a diverse population? You've got traders, farmers, soldiers, immigrants, into a single, cohesive political entity. The sources suggest Rome's genius lay in deploying narrative as a powerful fundamental tool for identity creation. They used myth deliberately.
They did. And they employed a really sophisticated dual narrative. And each story served a distinct psychological and political purpose. First, you have the purely local, the founding myth of Romulus and Remus.
The famous story of the she-wolf rescuing the twin infants, which is incredibly primal. But the actual outcome of the story is brutally political. The twins disagree over where the city should be built, and Romulus kills Remus, establishing himself as the sole king.
That narrative right there, it establishes a resilience and a willingness to commit fratricide for the sake of the city. The core messages embedded in that founding myth are incredibly clear, even harsh. You must be strong. You must fight your rival to establish primacy. And crucially, the sources interpret this as reinforcing the belief that Rome's existence and future dominance were an inevitable destiny. It was fated.
But then they don't just stop there. They layer the second, more global and historically impressive narrative on top of that. the myth of Aeneas.
Yes, Aeneas, the refugee prince from fallen Troy who travels west across the Mediterranean to establish the lineage that would eventually lead to Romulus. This narrative is, it's ancient spin. It's brilliant. It positions Rome not as some rough local village that started with a bloody squabble,
Right.
but as the direct continuation of the great classical history of the Trojans and, by extension, Greek civilization.
So they were essentially telling their citizens and everyone else, we are not ordinary people. We are the continuation of a great divinely sanctioned story. That provides immediate prestige and a justification for their rise.
It provides legitimacy, both internally and externally. What's fascinating in the analysis is how these myths functioned for the early, rapidly expanding population. They were the glue that created shared pride. They ensured state legitimacy in the eyes of neighboring powers, and most importantly, they built a public unity that was necessary for collective action.
You need everyone pulling the same direction.
Exactly. This function of creating a shared identity through narrative is precisely where institutions begin, long before anyone writes down a single law code.
You cannot govern people until they agree on who they are, which is a powerful lesson for any state-building project, even today.
And once that identity was established, the early kings, who served as these comprehensive leaders, military commanders, religious figures, judges, they began the physical and administrative organization of the city.
It was nation-building in Fast Forward. We see the shaping of the Forum Romanum, the heart of city life, and the organization of temples and sacred spaces. But perhaps most crucially for their future, they began constructing sophisticated public works like the Cloaca Maxima, that great sewer system, which suggests a commitment to long-term stability and health.
Precisely. That long-term commitment often required taking the best ideas from outside. And that brings us to Rome's famous trait of learning without just copying. The most notable external influence during this kingdom period came from the Etruscans, who were, at the time, far more culturally and technically advanced.
So what exactly did Rome borrow and then immediately sort of improve upon?
Rome integrated several key innovations. Architecturally, they adopted the arch structure, which was a superior engineering technique essential for later Roman aqueducts and bridges. They adopted religious elements, especially the practice of augury interpreting the will of the gods through natural signs, which became fundamental to political decision-making.
And most visibly, they adopted powerful symbols of governance, which cemented the authority of the kings and later the magistrates.
Yes, the symbols of office. The sources specifically highlight the adoption of the fasces, that bundle of rods enclosing an axe carried by lictors, which symbolized the magistrate's power over both corporal punishment, the rods, and capital punishment, the axe.
That's a pretty clear message.
A very clear message. They also adopted the purple-bordered toga, the distinctive seat of power known as the Sella Curulis, and even the triumphant procession itself.
So this established a defining Roman characteristic. They possessed this profound pragmatism. They took what they considered the best tools, whether architectural, spiritual, or political, developed them, and adapted them ruthlessly to their own needs, prioritizing function over any kind of cultural originality.
They were, in essence, the ultimate institutional engineers, completely unafraid to borrow a successful operating system from a competitor if it promised better results for the state.
But this early society was not a cohesive monolith, was it? It already contained the seeds of the great political struggles that would eventually tear the Republic apart centuries later. The stratification was set early and rigidly.
Oh, absolutely. We see the clear division. On one side, you have the patricians, the nobility, wealthy, claiming descent from the city's original founding fathers and holding the primary political and religious power.
And on the other, the plebeians. The general populace, the small farmers, the artisans, the traders, the numerical backbone of the army and the economy, but initially excluded from all the highest offices.
And tragically, underneath both, the extensive class of slaves, acquired primarily through warfare or debt bondage. The sources make it clear that this tripartite structure meant that the conflict between the nobility and the common man, with the term the conflict of the orders, was unavoidable once the state began to grow and accumulate wealth.
Let's delve into the daily life details because this helps us understand the psychological baseline. Housing was modest adobe and wood, not the marble city that would follow, but the structure of authority was absolute, centered on the paterfamilias.
The power of the paterfamilias, the father of the household, is terrifying by modern standards. He held Patria Potestas, which was absolute power over property, all major decisions, and even the power of life and death over his dependents, including his adult children and their wives.
Life and death, it's hard to imagine.
Now, while he rarely exercised that ultimate power of life and death, the legal framework granted him that scope. It's just an incredible amount of authority vested in one person.
It speaks volumes about the early Roman value system, this absolute hierarchy rooted in the family structure, which then translates directly into the state structure.
Exactly. And while women's roles were highly respected within the domestic sphere, managing the household, educating the young, they were severely limited in public life. They couldn't vote or hold office. Meanwhile, slavery was extensive, used in agriculture, construction, and complex domestic tasks, feeding the engine of the growing city.
Yet, despite this rigid hierarchy, the sources remind us that life wasn't purely restricted. The sense of community was vital and was fostered through shared religious festivals, communal meals, small races, and harvest celebrations.
That communal feeling was utterly essential. It provided the necessary internal unity and willingness to serve that was required for the next phase, military expansion.
Mhm.
If the patricians and plebeians hadn't shared that sense of the Roman community, the state would have fractured immediately under external pressures from stronger neighbors.
So that internal cohesion allowed Rome to move beyond mere defense. Why did expansion start? Was it an abstract goal or was it a necessity?
The sources are very clear on this. The impulse for organization and expansion was rooted in immediate necessity. It was about self-defense against surrounding hostile tribes like the Sabines, and a severe scarcity of land and resources for a growing population. Survival demanded effective organization that translated directly into superior military capability.
And this led to military development, disciplined small units, and critically, the cultivation of strong, durable alliances with neighbors.
That cultivation was Rome's masterstroke. Citizenship was a powerful, gradually expanding privilege offered to those who served and, often, to neighboring communities who aligned with Rome. This was fundamentally different from other ancient powers who would just subjugate conquered peoples. Rome offered incorporation and a potential for integration.
And here's the defining trait of early Roman warfare that set them apart. They learned to use war not just for destruction and extraction, but for establishing long-term order.
Yes, stability through organization. When Rome won, they didn't just walk away with loot. They imposed a stable system of treaties, roads, and a framework that ensured predictable commerce and less internal fighting between city-states. This made their alliances and conquests much more durable over time.
But the concentration of all this military and organizational power into the hands of a single king eventually led to the inevitable outcome: tyranny.
The break was inevitable. The tyranny of the last king, Tarquinius Superbus, specifically his family's abuses of power, led to a unified uprising by both the nobility and the common people. They recognized that absolute inherited power was the system's flaw.
It wasn't just one class against another, it was everyone against the king.
Everyone. The power of the king was definitively overturned, and this introduced the truly radical idea that would define their future. Power must be shared.
They looked at the monarchy, saw the inherent danger of a single individual holding all that military and judicial authority, and committed to never returning to that model. That commitment laid the foundation for the entire Republican system. That brings us to part 2, the Republican Revolution. The sources highlight that after overthrowing the king, Rome faced a choice: replicate the monarchy with a different strongman, or build a complex, distributed system. They chose the latter, creating a political blueprint that still resonates globally.
It was a system built on deep-seated political paranoia, which is often the best foundation for stability. The core principle was a pragmatic, deeply cynical understanding of human nature. Unlimited power in the hands of one person inevitably turns into oppression. They sought to build a wall against ambition.
But the way they did it was fascinating. It wasn't just about limiting power, it was about institutionalizing controlled conflict.
Precisely. Authority was deliberately split and divided among 3 main poles: the aristocratic Senate, the executive consuls, and the popular people's assemblies, which represented the plebeians. The genius was the constraint. No single entity could legally rule the state alone, or for too long.
So the goal was not necessarily immediate consensus, but a system where stability was achieved through continuous yet structured debate and negotiation between competing classes and competing individuals.
Absolutely. Roles were almost always time-limited, a year for the highest executive offices, and their powers were restricted by the power of others. This enforced rotation ensured that no one could cement their power base through legal means. Rome achieved both stability and dynamic, often brutal political debate simultaneously, which truly is a difficult political feat.
Let's delve into the actual mechanics, starting with the Senate. This wasn't a legislative body in the modern sense, was it? It was more of an advisory council, composed of 300 experienced statesmen, often former magistrates.
That's right. The Senate represented the memory and the continuity of the state. While its power was technically advisory, it passed resolutions, called Senatus Consulta, which were not automatically law around. Its authority, or auctoritas, derived from the massive prestige and experience of its members. They literally commanded the collective wisdom of the aristocracy.
So even if the Senate didn't technically pass a law, their opinion was functionally binding, especially in critical areas like foreign policy, war strategy, and most importantly, control of state finance. They were the ultimate check on rash action.
Yes, and their continuity contrasted sharply with the annual rotation of the executive branch, the consuls. Two consuls were elected annually, and they held imperium, the highest form of military and judicial power.
That dual leadership is the ultimate example of the check and balance philosophy. Two supreme executives, each holding veto power or intercessio over the other's actions. Why was that double structure so critical?
It was a structural preventative measure against absolute tyranny. Having two supreme executives meant that haste, corruption, and absolute power grabs were exponentially harder to achieve. During times of military crisis, they might alternate days in command, or one might command in Italy while the other was abroad.
Just to make sure no one person got too comfortable.
Exactly. This enforced division instilled the enduring lesson that power becomes safer and less prone to corruption the more it is shared and subjected to mutual oversight.
And the sources note that this model divided authority, annual terms, civilian command over the military, is the blueprint for so many later parliamentary and republican systems globally. It's impossible to overstate the influence of Rome's institutional design.
And we should probably mention the cursus honorum, the fixed hierarchy of political offices that any aspiring Roman politician had to climb. It wasn't enough just to be elected. You had to serve in lower offices, quaestor, aedile, praetor, to gain the necessary experience and prestige before you could even stand for the consulship.
So it was a ladder.
A very rigid ladder. It ensured that the highest executive offices were almost always filled by highly experienced, albeit aristocratic, individuals.
But, as we noted earlier, the system was fundamentally flawed in favor of the elite. The patrician aristocracy held the prestige and controlled the Senate, leading to intense friction with the plebeians, who felt excluded and arbitrarily judged.
This internal friction, often referred to as the conflict of the orders, was intense, but it also became the great engine of social progress for the Republic. The plebeians fought for recognition and rights, often employing some pretty radical tactics.
Specifically, the secessions, where the plebeians would literally boycott the city, withdrawing their labor and military service, and establishing their own parallel political structure on a nearby hill. They were essentially demanding, you cannot run the state without us, and we cannot live without our rights.
That pressure resulted in one of Rome's most enduring foundational achievements: the creation of the Law of the 12 Tables around 450 BCE. For the first time, the law covering civil procedure, debt, family law, property was written down and publicly displayed in the Forum.
This sounds simple, but its significance is hard to grasp today. Why did merely writing down the law change everything?
It ended the arbitrary nature of unwritten custom. Before the 12 Tables, patrician judges could interpret vague customs as they pleased, favoring their own class, especially regarding debt and inheritance. This made the law feel capricious and unjust to the plebeians.
So it was about predictability.
It was about predictability and objectivity. Once the law was codified, everyone knew the rules. It created an objective standard that even the most powerful magistrate was, in theory, subject to.
It effectively marked the definitive starting point of the concept of the rule of law in Rome. The state moved from a system where men could change the rules arbitrarily to one where the code itself provided stability.
And the plebeians didn't stop there. They gained their own official representatives, the tribunes of the plebes, who held sacrosanctity, meaning they could not be harmed. And, critically, the power of veto against any magistrate or Senate resolution that harmed a common citizen. The Republic wasn't just built on shared power. It was built on shared, formalized conflict between classes, which kept it dynamic for centuries.
The Republic proved its organizational capacity, and that efficiency rapidly transformed Rome from a defensive power into an aggressive regional hegemon. We move now to part 3, the engine of empire and the inevitable cracks that success created.
And Rome had to grow. This need was driven by internal population growth requiring more land, and the strategic pressure of consolidating control over Italy. This relentless pressure led to the formation and refinement of the Roman military machine, the legion system.
This isn't just an army, it's a technical innovation in warfare. What made the legion, specifically the manipular formation of the Republic, so superior to, say, the Greek phalanx?
The key was flexibility and adaptability. The Greek phalanx was a massive, unified block, devastating on flat terrain, but highly vulnerable if the line broke or if it fought on uneven ground. The Roman legion transitioned to the manipular system, organizing soldiers into smaller, flexible units called manipules, usually about 120 to 160 men.
And these manipules were deployed in three distinct lines, right?
Yes. The hastati, the youngest in front, the principes more experienced behind them, and the triarii, the veterans, at the back, armed with spears. They were often called the last reserve. The whole system was checkerboarded, allowing the first line to fall back through gaps in the second line to rest and reform, creating a fluid, rotating system of attack.
Like a wave.
Exactly. If the first line failed, the second could absorb the shock, and so on. It was a self-revolving, durable, and highly adaptive structure that could fight on hills and forests or on plains, while its enemies relied on rigid, single-mass formations.
And the incentives for service were deep. Being a soldier meant citizenship, honor, political and social capital, and the hope of spoils and land upon retirement. This fostered a deep institutional loyalty to Rome, the state, which was vital for long campaigns.
It was.
That concept of ordered conquest is key. Rome didn't just destroy. Their conquest model involved imposing roads, predictable markets, and a system of order and taxation.
This pragmatic approach created durability. Many cities found accommodation and compliance more beneficial than endless resistance. Rome offered stability and infrastructure, which were powerful incentives. The military logistics, that road network, became the commercial arteries of the Republic.
The system's ultimate test came with the Punic Wars, the clash against Carthage, the great naval and commercial power of North Africa. This was centuries of conflict that really decided who would dominate the entire Mediterranean basin.
This was Rome's existential moment. The source material emphasizes that the victory was total and transformative. Rome gained immense naval power, vast new territories, Sicily, Spain, North Africa, and established the Mediterranean as Mare Nostrum, our sea. They were now the sole global superpower of the Western world.
But the tragedy of success immediately set in. The victory flooded Rome with two things: immense wealth and a massive influx of war captives, which just exploded the slave economy.
And this is where the simple elegance of the Republic began to fracture. The sources highlight that these military victories created a severe, immediate social crisis right at home, one the political institutions were not designed to manage.
So the influx of cheap slave labor and massive war profits led to the unchecked growth of what the sources call great land ownership.
These massive landholders, the wealthy elite, began consolidating small farms into vast commercial estates known as latifundia. They could staff these enormous properties entirely with cheap slave labor, driving production costs down to nothing.
And the small farmer, the traditional backbone of the legion, the citizen soldier who voted in the plebeian assemblies, he couldn't compete. They went bankrupt, losing their land, and were forced to migrate to Rome, swelling the urban population into a massive, poverty-stricken proletariat, completely dependent on handouts.
The social and economic balance of the Republic was shattered. The very citizens who had won the wars for Rome were now economically displaced by the wealth the wars had generated. The community spirit was fractured, even as the state itself grew obscenities rich.
This crisis of inequality was the fatal wound. The state was too powerful to fall to external enemies, but its internal structure was rotting from the social and economic cancer. The institutions designed for a small city-state just could not handle the complexity of an empire.
Crucially, political reformers who recognized this danger, like the Gracchi brothers Tiberius and Gaius, who attempted to legislate land redistribution to settle the landless poor, were met not with debate, but with political violence and assassination, sanctioned by the conservative Senate.
So, the Republic's system of checks and balances failed precisely when it needed to function most, when addressing internal structural economic inequality. The use of violence against civic leaders, sanctioned by the state, normalized political murder, a terrible precedent.
And this internal struggle ushered in the period where power became terrifyingly personalized, especially within the military. A critical point of failure was the military reforms of figures like Marius, who created a professional army composed primarily of volunteers who served for pay, spoils, and the promise of land upon retirement.
And if the state couldn't deliver that promised land, which was often the case due to Senate infighting and obstruction, who did the soldier pledge his loyalty to?
To the general who could guarantee it. The loyalty shift is the critical mechanism of collapse. Armies started pledging allegiance to their commanders, not the state itself, because the soldiers' belief became undeniable. Our commander who marches with us and pays us, not the distant squabbling state, gives us our land.
And that's when the political game changes completely. Personal power, popularity, and sheer military charisma began to override the existing institutions of the Senate and the consuls. The system designed for civic rule was fundamentally broken. The stage was set for figures who understood that military power trumped civic law.
The endgame unfolded through a series of massive civil wars. Marius against Sulla, Pompey against Caesar, and finally Octavian against Antony. The Republican system, designed to prevent the rise of a king, instead became a fertile ground for warlords.
The ultimate dramatic climax was, of course, the confrontation with Julius Caesar, his military triumphs in Gaul, his unparalleled wealth, and his massive popular support among the urban masses and his veterans terrified the traditionalist Senate, who feared a king was returning.
And Rome faced an impossible self-created dilemma that the sources frame perfectly. Do we sacrifice the forms of the Republic to gain the strong man necessary for greater order and stability? Or do we desperately cling to the Republic even at the cost of endemic chaos and perpetual civil war?
The Republic was designed to prevent the strongman, but its own internal disorder and failure to address economic injustice seemed to demand one.
The result was the growing tension that exploded when Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The Civil War, the subsequent conspiracies, and the assassination of Caesar by those who wished to restore the Republic only resulted in more civil war. The irony is agonizing. Rome had defeated every external foe, but the Republic was mortally wounded by its own success, wealth, and the resulting internal disorder.
The transition to the imperial era was not a sudden decision. It was the inevitable conclusion of a half-century of institutional failure. The institutions of shared power simply could not survive the combined pressures of massive economic inequality and absolute military loyalty to individuals.
So to synthesize the enduring lessons from this extensive deep dive, the sources provide us with a masterclass in institutional success and eventual internal failure. The Republic teaches us first and foremost that institutional checks and the sharing of power are the key components required to strengthen and stabilize a diverse state.
Secondly, the critical lesson from the conflict of the orders and the 12 tables. If law is not written down and accessible, it is inherently arbitrary and vulnerable to the corruption and manipulation of the powerful elite. Codification is the prerequisite for justice.
Thirdly, and most tragically for Rome, success is often destabilizing. Conquest, even when total, creates profound internal crisis alongside immense wealth. The benefits often flow exclusively to the few, while the social costs, disorder, displacement, and class warfare are borne by the many who fought for that success.
That's a huge one. And finally, the ultimate political lesson derived from the late Republic. Regimes collapse not when they lose external battles, but when their armies become transactional, pledging loyalty to charismatic, ambitious individuals instead of the state and its abstract institutions. The moment loyalty becomes personalized, the civic system is doomed.
The Roman Republic grew by being pragmatic, learning, and adapting structures, political and military, that were superior to their neighbors. It was a machine designed for constant improvement and controlled conflict. But the ultimate price of that relentless growth was paid internally, with blood and institutional disorder.
The very system designed explicitly to prevent tyranny. The Republic, with its checks, balances, and annual term limits, ultimately created the necessary conditions for a new, absolute form of rule in the guise of the empire. This leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider. When the state is under extreme pressure, whether military or economic, when does the necessity for guaranteed stability outweigh the commitment to messy freedom? And is the choice between them, once internal violence has been normalized, ever truly avoidable?
It remains a powerful story that began with a village, a river, a few hills, and a grand ambition. And those decisions centuries ago are still echoing in the political systems we use today.
Okay, let's unpack this. When we talk about the Roman Empire, the narrative is usually dominated by spectacle.
Absolutely. It's the legions, the gladiators, the assassinations.
Right. Brings us to, well, to the monumental engineering feat that made it all possible.
It does. And the sources for this deep dive really demand that we look past the bloodshed and focus on the system.
The system.
Specifically, that 2-century period of unparalleled stability and prosperity we call the Pax Romana. It's the period when Rome truly shaped the Western world.
That's exactly it. Our mission today is to go beyond the myth of the legion and the gladius. We're trying to isolate the political, the architectural, the administrative components.
The literal operating manual.
Yes, the operating manual that allowed this sprawling, multi-ethnic empire to achieve such profound, long-lasting order.
And we're also looking at the internal stress tests, how they built this extraordinary world, but also the fragilities they baked into it from the very start.
So we're drawing on these detailed analyses that cover the transition from the Republic, the astonishing power of their infrastructure, and the subtle decay that began to fracture the system from within.
Right.
The core question we are holding up to the light is, how did Rome manage to centralize and sustain order across such a vast, diverse territory, and what were the inherent fragilities buried right beneath that surface of imperial splendor?
A big question. And I think the answer starts with exhaustion.
If we are looking for the moment of systemic change, we have to start with the patient on the operating table, the late Roman Republic. The sources are incredibly clear on this. Rome was absolutely exhausted by the time the first emperor emerged.
Exhausted is the perfect word. The Republic had been failing for nearly a century. We're talking about continuous, destructive civil wars.
This isn't just 1 or 2 bad decades.
Oh, no. Think about the timeline. The struggles of Marius and Sulla, the Gracchi brothers' attempts at land reform, which ended in bloodshed. And then you get the big ones, the spectacular feuds between Caesar, Pompey, and later Octavian and Antony.
And this instability had consequences far beyond just the political class in Rome.
It affected everyone. The sources emphasize that the Senate, which was once the symbol of Republican strength, was just weakened. It was indecisive, frequently gridlocked, or just plain overruled by powerful generals.
And more dangerously, the military structure had completely collapsed.
That's the critical pivot point. The army was no longer a state instrument. It was a collection of really personal mercenary forces.
So a soldier's loyalty wasn't to Rome.
Not at all. Soldiers swore oaths of loyalty to their commanders, to a Caesar or a Pompey. They expected to be paid and rewarded with land by that commander, not by some abstract Roman state.
Which means every ambitious general could instantly destabilize the entire republic. Chaos was the baseline.
It was. And if you're the average person, a farmer in Italy or a merchant in Gaul, what do you want?
Peace, security.
Security and food. The analysis we reviewed boils it down to those 2 existential demands. Give us stability and give us bread. Panem in circenses.
And when the state fails to deliver those 2 basic guarantees, the public will actively seek an alternative.
Exactly. Regardless of the cost to political freedom. The realization among the Romans was stark. The complex, decentralized system of checks and balances, the very thing that defined the Republic, was too inefficient. It was too reliant on squabbling, self-interested elites to govern a continental empire.
So to get lasting functioning order, you needed something else.
You needed a single, strong, central authority.
So enter Octavianus. The genius of his move wasn't conquering Rome, it was convincing Rome that he hadn't. Our sources call his takeover a coup d'etat by stealth, which is a fascinating way to put it.
It's the ultimate masterclass in political optics.
Yeah.
I mean, Octavian understood the deep-seated Roman phobia of monarchy. They had chased out their last king centuries ago, and the very word rex was toxic.
Right, you just did not call yourself a king.
No. So he didn't call himself a dictator or a king. He adopted the title princeps.
The first citizen?
The first citizen. It sounds so humble, doesn't it? Just one of the guys. But that humility disguised absolute, comprehensive control.
Okay, so how did he actually achieve that legal authority without triggering a massive rebellion? Because on the surface, he's just another citizen.
This is where you have to get into the weeds of the analysis. It wasn't just a title change. It was the clever accumulation of traditional Republican powers into one singular person.
Okay, break that down.
Well, first, he maintained proconsular imperium, that's military command authority, over the most critical provinces, the ones with all the legions, like Gaul, Spain, Syria.
So he controlled the army.
He controlled the vast majority of the army. And then, crucially, he also held tribunician power.
Which was the power of the tribunes of the plebs, the protectors of the common people.
Exactly. And that power gave him personal inviolability. You couldn't harm him. The right to veto any governmental action, and the ability to propose legislation directly to the people's assemblies.
Wait, veto any action?
Any action from the Senate, from the other magistrates, he could just say no. So by combining the military control of a proconsul with the legislative and protective powers of a tribune offices that were never supposed to overlap in one person, he legally became the center of gravity for the entire system.
All while maintaining the fiction that the Republic was still functioning?
Precisely. He could stand up and say, I am not a king, and technically be correct, but functionally, every decision of importance had to pass through him, the palace, or his inner circle.
And this consolidation was followed immediately by deep structural reform, making the state functional again.
He had to. The sources list 4 key areas where he targeted reform. And we should probably start with the military, because that's the source of the initial chaos.
It had to be number 1 on the list.
Absolutely non-negotiable. Augustus ended the reliance on individual commanders paying their troops. He implemented a system of regular state salaries and, really importantly, established pensions, a retirement plan for soldiers.
That fundamentally shifts the army's loyalty, doesn't it? From a temporary warlord back to the emperor and the imperial treasury.
It completely changes the game. He standardized the conditions of service and removed the incentive for generals to constantly wage war just to loot for their troops. The state was now the reliable paymaster.
That seems like an enormously costly but necessary stability measure.
It was. And it was funded by this second major reform, stabilizing the provincial tax system.
Ah, the infamous publicani.
Yes. Historically, taxes had been collected by these private contractors who would bid for the right to tax a region. And then, of course, they would extort the maximum possible amount for personal profit.
Which I imagine was a primary cause of provincial unrest and revolt.
A huge cause. So Augustus began to phase them out. The reform was structural. He replaced the publicani with salaried, state-controlled officials, often drawn from the equestrian class, the business class, who were accountable directly to him.
And he also mandated better census data to make sure the assessments were fair.
Right. It reduced corruption, it stabilized provincial income for the state, and maybe most importantly, it made the provinces feel less abused, which strengthened their loyalty to Rome.
And the third and fourth points were more visible, more tangible improvements for the average person.
Yes, very visible. Infrastructure repair, particularly roads. The Roman road network was a marvel, and he invested heavily in it for both military movement and commerce. And finally, just quelling widespread banditry and disorder. He provided the security and the structure the public had been demanding for generations.
And what he established, what all this reform led to, was the Pax Romana, roughly 2 centuries of Roman peace. When we say peace, though, it's crucial to define what that actually means on a day-to-day basis.
It was revolutionary. The sources define it not as the total absence of conflict. Rome was certainly still fighting wars on its frontiers, in Britain, in Dacia.
Sure, the borders were active.
The borders were always active, but the key was the absence of catastrophic, empire-shattering civil wars. This meant stable succession for the most part, stable laws, and predictable governance.
And the economic consequences of that stability were transformative.
They were explosive. That stability paved the way for a massive revitalization of trade and commerce. We're talking about the establishment of the first genuinely, globalized economy of the Western world.
With standardized coinage, a universal legal system.
And critically, a military powerful enough to sweep the seas clean of piracy. Suddenly, you could ship goods from Egypt to Spain with a reasonable expectation they would actually arrive.
But when we call this a globalized economy, is that truly equitable? Or looking critically at the sources, was it more accurately a highly organized system of resource extraction benefiting Italy and a few key urban centers?
That's a really probing question, and the analysis supports a nuanced view. It was absolutely an extractive system. Silk from the East, grain from Egypt, metals from Britain, wine from Gaul, it all flowed towards the center.
Swords rope.
Primarily. But it wasn't a one-way street. The provinces that participated got a massive return on their investment. They got access to the vast Roman markets, they got legal protection, and they got that incredible infrastructure. Roads, aqueducts, bridges.
So it was a system that benefited the center most, but still offered significant benefits to the periphery.
Exactly. And that economic boom fueled massive increases in population and urbanization. The city of Rome itself swelled to perhaps 1 million inhabitants, an unmatched concentration of people in the ancient world.
And geographically, the Mediterranean Sea, which had been this wild frontier during the Republic, was entirely tamed.
It became Mare Nostrum Arsi. You could think of it as a Roman internal lake, allowing for reliable, low-cost transport of grain and goods. It was the superhighway of the ancient world.
And that peace was maintained by something more complex than just legionary patrols on the borders.
Oh, absolutely. The mechanisms of the Pax Romana relied heavily on strong legal structures and orderly administration. The military held the borders, but stability inside was maintained by the universal application of Roman law.
So, contract enforcement, property rights?
All of it. It established recourse and predictability. And that legal framework created the necessary conditions for massive, sustained commerce to thrive.
Let's get under the hood of that imperial machine again. We've established that power was centralized in the emperor, but what was the actual machinery of governance? He wasn't signing every decree himself.
No, of course not. The emperor was the final decision maker, but the sheer scale of the empire necessitated a growing professional administration. And while the Senate persisted, it was, as the analysis shows, largely symbolic.
What was its real function then, if not making policy?
It became the training ground and the social club for the imperial elite. Senators were drawn from the highest families, and they provided the pool of experienced administrators who would be appointed to govern less critical provinces or command legions. It still held immense prestige.
But the real day-to-day work?
Was increasingly handled by the professional imperial bureaucracy. And this was a fascinating group, often staffed by highly trained, educated freedmen, former slaves, and members of the equestrian class. This was a meritocracy of administration, distinct from the aristocracy of the Senate.
And managing an empire stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia required delegating control without losing it. That brings us to their sophisticated, decentralized management style in the provinces.
That co-optation strategy was brilliant. Rome assigned governors to provinces, but they didn't try to micromanage every little thing. Instead, they focused on establishing deep cooperation with local elites.
So if you were a local chieftain in Gaul or a city councilor in Greece,
Rome's message was basically, you can keep your regional prestige, your local customs, and your wealth, provided you do three things for us: uphold Roman law, collect Roman taxes, and maintain order.
so local aristocrats essentially became junior partners in the Roman enterprise.
They did. And the sources detail the benefits. These local elites gained access to the vast Roman trade network, protection from external enemies, and most importantly, their sons and grandsons gradually became eligible for Roman citizenship and even access to the Senate itself.
It created loyalty through self-interest. The system became worth defending because their families were directly invested in its success.
Precisely. And this leads directly to the expansion of Roman identity.
It wasn't just about being conquered anymore.
No, it was a gradual but profound process. Roman citizenship, initially reserved for the inhabitants of Rome and Italy, was systematically expanded over the centuries. By the 2nd century CE, vast numbers of provincials felt not just like subjects, but truly Roman.
And that was solidified with the Edict of Caracalla.
In 212 CE exactly, Emperor Caracalla issued the Constitutio Antoniana, granting citizenship to virtually all free inhabitants of the empire.
That act in itself shows an awareness that long-term stability relied on binding the peripheries to the center, not just through chains, but through shared civic identity.
It created a loyalty that military occupation alone could never achieve. It gave millions of people across continents a shared legal framework, a shared language of power Latin, and a shared stake in the imperial project.
So the Pax Romana wasn't just administrative policy, it was physical, visible, and everywhere. Rome was determined to build its narrative, and they inscribed that power directly into the physical infrastructure of the empire.
Absolutely. The sources analyze Roman construction not merely as shelter or utility, but as a deliberate political statement. It was a projection of order, identity, and authority into scone.
So every structure, from a bridge to a basilica, carried a message.
And that message was, Rome is strong, Rome is orderly, Rome is permanent. The magnificence was essential to the ideology.
When a foreign dignitary or a new provincial subject entered a Roman city, the architecture was designed to hit them immediately.
It was calculated psychological warfare. You encountered wide, straight avenues based on military precision, massive public forums opening onto immense squares, imposing temples dedicated to state gods, and, most impressively, those massive triumphal arches commemorating victories.
The design goal was to overwhelm and instill awe.
Exactly. To reinforce the narrative of Roman technological and civilizational supremacy before a word was even spoken.
And none of this grandeur would have been possible without what the analysis calls the game changer. Roman concrete, opus cementitium. The sources stress that this innovation was truly revolutionary.
It unlocks structural capabilities that were previously unimaginable. Unlike traditional mortar, Roman concrete incorporated volcanic ash, specifically a type called pozzolana.
And what did that do?
That ingredient allowed the mixture to set rapidly, even underwater, and it gave them immense tensile strength and a durability that has resisted chemical decay for centuries. It's why so many of their structures are still standing.
So what did this material science breakthrough allow Roman architects and engineers to do that the Greeks and others couldn't?
It freed them from relying solely on stacking heavy, precisely cut stones held together by compression. That inherently limits the size of your spans.
The post and lintel system.
Right. Concrete allowed for entirely new forms. The arch, the barrel vault, and crucially, the dome. They could mold the material into any shape they needed, creating structures with wider spans, greater internal volume, and significantly higher stability.
It also must have drastically reduced the complexity and cost of construction, making these monumental projects feasible across the entire empire.
That's a key point often missed. Concrete meant the labor requirements for precision stone cutting decreased significantly. It required less highly specialized skilled labor, making it easier and faster to replicate the Roman aesthetic in every new provincial capital from Britain to Africa.
And we see this technical mastery expressed most perfectly in their monumental structures. Let's start with the Colosseum. It was not just an entertainment venue.
No, it was the ultimate stage for public politics and control. As the analysis notes, it was where tens of thousands gathered, and where the emperor could literally be seen by the public, reinforcing his role as the dispenser of resources and patron of the games.
And the spectacle itself.
The spectacle, the gladiatorial combat, the elaborate set pieces, the wild animal hunts, it channeled any potential social dissent or political unrest into a shared, cathartic experience. It was a celebration of Roman power over nature and their enemies.
Then we have the Pantheon, an entirely different engineering and philosophical statement.
The Pantheon is a testament to the sophistication of Roman structural theory. It's characterized by that perfect dome, which was, at the time of its construction, the largest unsupported dome in the world.
How did they even do that? How do you build a dome that massive out of concrete without it collapsing under its own weight?
It's brilliant. Roman engineers used concrete aggregates that became progressively lighter towards the top. Near the base, they used heavy materials like basalt and granite. High up near the oculus, they used lightweight materials like crushed pumice stone.
A brilliant piece of material manipulation. And the famous oculus at the top, the light eye, that's not just a hole in the roof, is it?
No, it's a deliberate architectural device. The analysis suggests that the shifting beam of sunlight entering the oculus gives everyone standing inside the sensation of being directly beneath the heavens. It transformed the space from secular to divine, symbolically connecting the power of the imperial state to the cosmos.
And finally, the triumphal arches, like those of Titus or Constantine. They seem purely decorative, but the sources assign them a much more profound function.
Their function was, quite literally, to defeat the fleeting nature of human memory.
To make history permanent.
Exactly. They were designed to ensure that the memory of Rome's critical military victories and the legitimacy of the emperor would survive the human lifespan. By carving the narrative of triumph into stone, they guaranteed that the state's official, glorious history would be immutable, a fixed record against the variability of oral tradition.
The Romans didn't just build monuments, they engineered highly functional, livable cities, perhaps the most technologically advanced and planned settlements the world had ever seen.
This functional design element is the true genius of Roman urbanization. It stems from their military roots. The standardized layout of the Roman military camp, the castrum, with its precise grid plan, often became the blueprint for new cities.
Which ensured immediate order, clear land division, and efficient administration from day one.
Right. And the success of those cities depended entirely on vital systems that often go unnoticed.
Like the water supply.
Start with the water supply. The aqueducts were phenomenal engineering feats, using gravity and precise gradients to transport clean water, sometimes for dozens of miles, into the heart of the city. This provided water for public fountains, private homes, and sanitation.
And sanitation was just as critical for managing that high urban density.
The sewage systems, most famously the Cloaca Maxima in Rome, kept cities relatively clean and reduced the spread of disease, which is the only way you can have 1 million people living in one place in the pre-modern world.
And connecting it all was that network of roads and bridges.
Paved roads and stone bridges, some of which are still in use today, link the empire, ensuring rapid military response and efficient commerce. The infrastructure was the skeleton that held the whole body together.
And within this functional urban setting, the baths emerge as the critical social hub.
The baths were so much more than places for hygiene. The sources emphasized their role as integrated social centers. They were democratic spaces in a way.
How's
Well, rich and poor could go. They combine exercise, relaxation, conversation, business networking, even lending libraries. The complexity of the internal heating systems, the hypocost, showed just how much effort went into making these social centers enjoyable year-round. They were essential for maintaining the social fabric of the city.
Moving into visual culture, the sources confirm that Roman art was rarely art for art's sake. It had a definitive political purpose, the glorification and stabilization of the state.
We see this tension play out in their sculpture. Early Roman portraiture, known as verism, often favored a kind of hyperrealism.
You see every wrinkle, every scar.
Every single one. And the message was explicit. Our leaders are experienced, they have struggled, and they possess gravitas. This was a projection of Republican virtue.
But once the empire solidified, that hyperrealism gave way to something slightly different in imperial statues, didn't it?
It did. Imperial statues, while still sometimes retaining realistic features, explicitly reinforced the concept of authority and divine connection. Emperors were often depicted in idealized military poses, draped in cloaks of state, or even alongside images of gods, connecting their political power to cosmic approval. It was a sophisticated blend of grounded realism and divine authority.
Beyond the state-mandated statues, what do the visual arts tell us about private life?
The wall paintings, particularly the detailed frescoes preserved in places like Pompeii, are invaluable. They offer rich, textural glimpses into domestic life.
So you see gardens, mythological scenes.
Dining etiquette, landscapes. They reveal the tastes and aspirations of the elite. Meanwhile, floor mosaics served as highly visible demonstrations of wealth and taste, sometimes depicting complex historical scenes or mythological figures, turning the floor into a storytelling canvas.
And bringing back to the idea of permanence, those inscriptions, the carved words, how essential were they to the stability of the empire?
Absolutely essential. Laws, records of victories, the names of benefactors, public decrees, they were all deliberately carved into stone. This provided a fixed, non-erasable record. It was a permanent administrative and historical archive, a constant physical reminder that Rome exists, its laws are valid, and its victories are eternal.
Let's ground this splendor in the day-to-day reality of the people living under the Pax Romana. The contrast in housing alone is astonishing.
It's the perfect illustration of Roman inequality. The wealthy lived in the domed, spacious, single-family courtyard homes designed for privacy and light, often with elaborate internal gardens called peristyles.
But the vast majority of people in a city like Rome
Lived in the insula-crowded, multi-story apartment blocks that could reach 6 or 7 stories high.
and the sources confirm that life in the insula was often precarious and unsafe, correct?
Highly unsafe. They were often poorly constructed with cheap materials, and fire was a constant, terrifying threat. They confirm the density and the palpable social tension of the urban centers, where high rents and the constant danger of collapse or fire were normalized realities for the average Roman.
Turning to family structure, the legal and social definition of power rested heavily on the paterfamilias. The father held ultimate authority.
Legally, the paterfamilias held patria potestas supreme authority over decisions, inheritance, property, and even technically the life and death of his children, regardless of their age.
That sounds absolute.
Legally it was. But the analysis reveals a critical contradiction. Practical power versus legal power. We need to focus on the nuance.
Go on.
While women's public influence was officially limited, they couldn't hold office, they wielded tremendous practical power within the home and the social sphere. Through the manipulation of their dowries and extensive social networks, wealthy Roman women often gained substantial de facto economic independence. They were critical players in political and economic maneuvering behind the scenes.
Moving to the economy, we discussed the boom, but who was the engine driving the labor?
The economy was driven by a complex mix. You had farmers in the fields, artisans in specialized workshops, merchants facilitating trade, and yes, slave labor was widespread and crucial, particularly in large-scale agriculture, the latifundia, and in mining. It underpinned the wealth of the elite.
But was the economy totally reliant on slavery?
No, and that's an important distinction. Free labor and trade played a vital economic role. What's crucial to understand is the state's role. The imperial government heavily intervened, particularly in the grain supply, the annona,
Regulating prices and ensuring distribution.
to maintain social stability and prevent urban rioting. The Pax Romana required this controlled market to survive.
And outside of work and politics, how did Romans use their leisure time?
Leisure was highly organized and very political. Romans loved festivals, theater performances, chariot races in the Circus Maximus, and of course, gladiator fights. These spectacles weren't just entertainment. They were vital social outlets and provided opportunities for the emperor to be seen dispensing patronage.
And the baths remained the primary venue for mixing business with pleasure.
Absolutely. The social hub of daily life.
Finally, weaving through all these aspects of life was the Roman polytheistic religion.
It was thoroughly integrated. There wasn't a separation of church and state. Gods governed every aspect of life. Mars for war, Ceres for harvest, Vesta for the home. The analysis stresses that the state and religion were inseparable. Key priests were often high-ranking political figures, and reverence for the emperor was a civic duty with religious weight, ensuring that belief systems supported the established political order.
The structures were magnificent, the administration was efficient, and the peace was profound. Yet the sources make it clear that internal stresses were constantly eroding the foundations of the system. The illusion of permanence was challenged first by a rising financial burden.
The Pax Romana came with an immense, accelerating price tag. The world outside the borders, particularly the Germans along the Rhine and Danube rivers in the north, and the powerful Sassanid Empire in the east, never stopped applying pressure. They required permanent vigilance.
Maintaining that vast, thousands of miles long border required an impossibly large standing army.
And that's the financial Achilles heel of the empire. The necessary size of the military meant expenditure skyrocketed, leading to a relentless, progressively harder struggle to sustain the state financially.
So the cost of guaranteeing peace eventually outweighed the economic benefit of that peace.
Over time, yes. It's a profound paradox. The very tool used to achieve stability became the primary driver of instability.
Because as the military burden grew, internal economic decay accelerated.
It did. The analysis highlights financial instability marked by crippling inflation. And this inflation was often state-driven, as emperors began to debase the silver coinage.
Meaning they added more base metals like copper to the silver coins to stretch the supply.
Exactly, to pay the troops. But this reduced the currency's actual value.
Which means the heavy taxation required to fund the army became worthless almost as soon as it was collected.
Leading to ever higher taxation, which in turn stifled the economy. Production levels dropped, compounded by structural issues in the labor model. The economy had relied on continuous expansion and the influx of slave labor. Once expansion stopped, that supply of new, cheap labor dried up and the economy began to stall.
And this triggered serious social shifts.
It did. Cities became dangerously overcrowded due to economic pressure and the perception of greater security there, leading to what we call rural flight. The agricultural countryside, the true economic engine, began to empty out.
Putting extreme stress on the very food supply the system was built to guarantee.
The whole system started to eat itself. And when economic and social order fails, politics becomes feral. The analysis describes a return to the political chaos Augustus fought so hard to eliminate.
We enter the crisis of the 3rd century.
Right. Generals, backed by their newly localized armies, which were focused on border defense, not central loyalty, began fighting each other for the throne. The result was a rapid, often violent succession of emperors.
When the central authority is a revolving door of military strongmen, the legitimacy and stability of the entire imperial system shatters.
It completely breaks down.
And alongside this military and economic breakdown, a profound, quiet conversion was happening within Roman society, the growth of Christianity.
This was a fundamental cultural challenge. The first Christian communities emerged in Roman cities, often small and clandestine. And they were viewed with immense suspicion by the Roman state.
Why?
Because they refused to participate in the civic religion, and crucially, refused to worship the emperor. This refusal was seen not as a religious disagreement, but as political treason, a failure of pietas or duty to the state.
So it was perceived as a direct threat to the core identity of the empire.
Absolutely. The movement spread steadily, experiencing periods of intense state-mandated persecution when emperors felt particularly insecure. But the turning point came under Constantine. The Edict of Milan in 313 CE granted religious freedom.
It essentially allowed Christianity to exist legally alongside the state religions.
And from there it slowly began its rise to become the dominant faith. But this was far more than just a religious shift. It transformed the underlying Roman mindset.
How so?
The sources confirm this deep cultural transformation. Traditional Roman religion emphasized public ritual, state duty, and an often vague afterlife. Christianity offered a radically different focus: personal salvation, deep community charity, and an emphasis on the individual's relationship with a monotheistic deity. This shift in loyalty and morality created a parallel structure of authority that eventually challenged the emperor's divine claims.
Faced with simultaneous external pressure, internal economic collapse, and political chaos, the empire attempted one last radical structural solution.
Emperor Diocletian. He recognized that the empire was simply too large for one man to govern effectively and secure all the borders at once. His solution was administrative.
He divided it.
He formally divided Rome into the Eastern Roman Empire and the Western Roman Empire, establishing the Tetrarchy to ensure smoother succession and more localized governance.
A necessary measure for efficiency, but one that solidified existing problems.
It did. It structurally separated two halves that already possessed significant economic disparities. The Eastern Empire, centered on the wealthy, densely populated, and fiscally stable provinces of Egypt and Asia Minor, became economically stronger.
While the West, reliant on a struggling agricultural base and facing the heaviest barbarian incursions, accelerated its decline.
Exactly. And the ultimate fate of the two halves was radically different. The Western collapse accelerated. Massive migrations, often driven by groups fleeing the Huns, turned into military raids. Cities were sacked, and local authorities increasingly relied on local military commanders rather than the distant emperor.
And ultimately, the centralized political authority of the Western Roman Empire just crumbled.
It did, but the division saved the system in the East.
That's the key takeaway.
It is. Even though the city of Rome, the ancient heart, fell, the Eastern Roman Empire, centered at Constantinople, what we call Byzantium, continued to thrive for another 1,000 years. This demonstrates that the imperial system, the centralized bureaucracy and tax structure, was robust enough to survive. It just couldn't support the increasingly weak, financially strapped West.
As we conclude this deep dive, let's reflect on the Roman aesthetic legacy. When we distill the sources, what was the core intention behind everything they built?
The analysis highlights three core values that define the Roman aesthetic: order, measure, and utility. Structures had to be functional, solving real-world problems like water delivery or sanitation, but they also had to be magnificent,
Art and architecture were the explicit language of authority.
designed to project permanence and control.
The story of the Pax Romana leaves us with an enduring paradox of greatness.
It does. Rome was one of history's most successful projects of order, stability, and engineering ingenuity. But this deep dive shows us that even the most robust, well-engineered powers stand on remarkably fragile foundations. It is far more difficult and infinitely more costly to protect a massive integrated state over centuries than it is to build one.
They perfected the system only to be financially broken by the burden of maintaining it.
That's it in a nutshell.
And the echoes of that permanence are inescapable today.
We use their influence daily. The standardized grid of cities, the concept of a professional civil service, the enduring structure of planned roads and stone bridges, and the architectural principles of the arch and the dome. The voice of that civilization that learned to speak through stone is absolutely audible in our modern governance and infrastructure.
So what does this whole analysis mean for us, the people trying to navigate our own complex global systems today?
Well, this deep dive shows us that the 200 years of Roman peace were a monumental, sustained, and immensely expensive stability project. The analysis consistently points to the delicate internal balance between the economy's ability to generate wealth, the army's cost of security, and the political center's legitimacy.
That three-legged stool.
Exactly. The foundations did not fail due to a single catastrophic invasion. They failed because the costs of defense outpaced the economy's ability to sustain them. That led directly to the debasement of currency and the subsequent political chaos.
So if the most robust, meticulously engineered empire in history was susceptible to the imbalance of that exact tripod economy, army, and political center,
It forces us to consider the hidden costs and inherent fragilities beneath the surface of our own highly interconnected global systems today. Stability is not a natural state. It is an ongoing, costly engineering project. Okay, let's unpack one of the most complex balancing acts in modern civilization. We're doing a deep dive into Rome, a city that just refuses to give up its past, but at the same time is really struggling to be a modern city.
it's the ultimate time warp, isn't it? You step off a bus and you're literally standing on pavement laid by emperors. and then a scooter zips past you. The core thing about Rome, and this really came through in the sources, is that it's fundamentally layered.
Exactly. Layered is the perfect word. Our source material frames this so well. Rome isn't just a city where history happened. It's a place where you're actively journeying through time. You walk on ancient stones, you turn a corner, boom, a medieval church, and right next to it, a Renaissance palace.
And that compression, that layering creates this paradox we're here to understand. It's a massive world built up over centuries. It's not a museum under glass, not at all, but it also can't be, completely modern. It's more like a living organism.
Right, an organism that's constantly negotiating the tension between its own history and the need to function today.
Mm.
So that's our mission for this deep dive. To get into those constant negotiations, the immense difficulty, and also some of the surprisingly modern solutions Rome is using to keep this synthesis alive.
Yeah.
We want to show you the hidden complexities.
And the best place to start is, well, literally beneath the surface.
Under the ground.
Exactly. Because beneath all the traffic and the noise, beneath the city you see every day, there is a vast, incredibly rich archaeological world just waiting. This isn't just a theory, it's the physical reality of building anything in Rome.
And this is where it gets so fascinating. That ancient world, it's not static, it's always resurfacing the second modern life tries to expand. You think about any routine project, digging a metro line, a new building foundation, even just repaving a street.
The past just emerges, always.
Always.
The sources gave some amazing details on this. I mean, take the new Metroline C. The engineers had to dig deeper than in almost any other city on Earth. We're talking 100 feet down sometimes.
100 feet, just to get under the history.
Just to bypass the upper layers of history. And this challenge, it means they constantly have to stop construction, sometimes for years, while archaeologists come in to do emergency digs.
So the city itself is kind of an involuntary preservation mechanism.
It is. The simple act of building something new becomes an archaeological investigation. It has to be.
And the sources had a really beautiful analogy for what the archaeologists are doing.
They did. They're reading the city like a book, page by page. Every time they peel back another layer of soil, every foundation stone they find, it adds a new detail. It clarifies Rome's story. They're not just finding little fragments. They're finding whole chapters.
And these chapters, what are they revealing? I mean, it's so much more than just a few bits of broken pottery.
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about intact sections of the old Imperial Forum, buried stretches of the ancient roads, the VA, stunning mosaics from Roman villas, tombs, and even, the ruins of smaller amphitheaters that just got built over in the Middle Ages.
Which means you can't even begin to talk about urban planning in Rome without talking to an archaeologist first. The past is literally the blueprint.
It is.
And that brings us right to the great tension. The sources really hammer this home as the central question for the city. How do we protect history? But how does the modern city live?
This is the critical conflict. On one side, you've got these immense modern pressures. Rome is home to nearly 3 million people. They need housing, they need infrastructure, they need a functioning economy.
The traffic is famously terrible, so a project like a new metro line isn't a luxury, it's vital.
It's vital for quality of life.
Yeah.
But all of that runs straight into the non-negotiable need to conserve. And this isn't just about saving the Colosseum, it's about protecting the original street grid, thousands of scattered monuments, and all those archaeological sites we were just talking about.
Which often have to be cordoned off, right? Just taken out of commission for modern use.
Permanently. And this leads to this constant bureaucratic negotiation. It's a real tug of war between the city council, which is, trying to solve traffic flow and housing, and the superintendency. That's the state body for archaeology. Their only job is to preserve.
Wait, I want to clarify something here. Does this mean that even when they do try to restore things, it's controversial? The sources mention these huge public debates.
Absolutely. The public, academics, they argue all the time over what they call historical fidelity. So for instance, when you're restoring the Roman Forum, what does that mean? Do you only use original materials, even if they're fragile?
Or do you use modern, reversible materials like steel or glass to stabilize the site, to help people visualize what was there?
Exactly, and there's no easy answer. So the argument isn't just about how it looks, it's about authenticity. It's about responsibility.
History in Rome, as the sources put it, isn't just a tourist attraction. It's a responsibility and a burden.
A burden. That's a strong word, but it's true. The sheer weight of 2,000 years dictates everything. It slows down modernization constantly. And very few cities on Earth carry that kind of weight.
And if we shift focus a bit, this struggle isn't just about stone and cement. It affects the economy. the spiritual life, the daily reality for the people who actually live there.
Well, you can't possibly talk about Rome without talking about the Vatican. It's geographically tiny, less than half a square kilometer, but it's a sovereign state sitting right inside the city.
And that gives it this massive political and cultural leverage.
It's fascinating how it functions. It's the spiritual heart of the Christian world, of course, but it's also a diplomatic powerhouse, an unparalleled museum, and a center for art.
So when you're standing in St. Peter's Square, you're not just in a plaza, you're at the intersection of history, faith, diplomacy.
Yeah.
It's all right there. The city frames the present.
But that gravity, that historical weight, comes with a huge economic price tag, and that is paid for mostly by tourism.
Yeah, the economy is so reliant on it. You've got the museums, the tour guides, the restaurants, all the souvenirs, and, the film industry that uses Rome as this incredible backdrop.
And the problem, which the sources make very clear, is that this reliance is a classic double-edged sword. It brings in vital income, of course. But the sheer volume of visitors, we're talking tens of millions every year, brings crowding and a very real risk of destroying the very things they've come to see.
Every footstep on a 1,000-year-old road wears it down just that little bit more.
Precisely. And that risk spills over into daily life. We saw that quote in the material about how local residents sometimes feel like they don't own their city.
Their home becomes an international heritage site first, and a place to live second. You see high rents, driven by all the short-term vacation lets, pushing out Roman families who have lived there for generations.
So the big debate now is about finding a solution. They're talking about balanced tourism. It's not about stopping people from coming. It's about managing the numbers with timed tickets for the big sites, creating itineraries to push people out of the absolute center.
And maybe implementing policies to protect local housing and small businesses.
Exactly.
It's a huge challenge.
But even with all this history, all this gravity, we have to remember, Rome is a functioning city. I mean, life flows every day in those squares and down those little streets. You see the laundry hanging from the balconies. It's real.
It's a real place, dealing with incredibly modern problems. They have high youth unemployment, just like any big European city. They have terrible traffic gridlock. Waste management is a constant struggle. All of this is happening right there in the middle of history.
And the fact that they manage it, that they negotiate the ancient and the modern every single day, that brings us to Rome's real genius. It's beyond the buildings. Rome's most enduring legacy is actually the ideas it gave to the world. This is the part that shapes your life, even if you've never set foot in the city. Let's break down those pillars. First, and probably the most important, is law.
We just take it for granted, don't we? But the vast majority of modern legal systems, especially in Europe and the Americas, they have the core principles of Roman law baked right in.
Think about the concept of written law, lex scripta. The idea that rules are codified, not just based on custom. Or the definition of a citizen with specific rights and responsibilities. Our entire system of property and contracts, it owes a massive debt to Roman legal thinking.
It's the intellectual framework for how we organize ourselves.
It is. Then you have urbanism. The Roman idea that the city is an idea of order. That's an enduring principle. You see their structure, the forum as a central civic space, the grid of roads branching out in countless cities built ever since.
And it's not just a historical curiosity, is it? I remember the sources saying that modern traffic planners actually study the old Roman road networks.
They do. They study them to see how the Romans managed high volumes of travel between provinces, looking for clues for modern highway design. The old principles are still surprisingly effective.
And finally, of course, there's language and culture. Latin didn't die. It fractured and evolved into Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Romanian, half of Europe.
And beyond language, just think about the symbols and the vocabulary. We still use words like Senate, capital, republic. It's just imprinted on our political DNA.
So looking forward, this incredible legacy raises some really tough modern questions. What happens with climate change? More intense heat, changing rainfall. How will that affect ancient structures made of marble and travertine?
That's a huge, huge challenge. And it's coupled with those older questions. Where do you stop development? Where do the new metro lines and highways have to stop? At what point does preservation actually start to harm the people who live there now?
It's a profound dilemma. But the sources do point to some forward-looking solutions. They're pushing hard on digital archaeology, for example.
Right, using 3D modeling and virtual reality to preserve sites digitally so you can analyze them without physically interfering with them.
And that ties into sustainable tourism projects. and trying to instill a historical consciousness in the younger generations, teaching them that they are the custodians of all this.
And this whole commitment, this unique philosophy, it all comes down to Rome's ultimate answer, which was summarized perfectly in our material. The city must renew without destroying the past.
That's basically an instruction manual for civilization.
It is. As we wrap up this deep dive, the central takeaway is pretty clear. Rome's existence proves that a civilization isn't just about making new things. It's about preserving, learning from, and actively transmitting that knowledge forward.
And the final, powerful thought for you to consider comes straight from the source material. Rome has been destroyed, rebuilt, and changed countless times by invaders, fires, time itself. But it has never disappeared. And the reason is, Rome is not just stone, it's memory.
So you have to ask yourself, what does that suggest about the future of any civilization, including our own, right now, that protects and prioritizes its collective memory? It's a question about survival that Rome just answers, simply by still being there, reminding us where we all came from.